All right, guys, so moving on to a new question here. I really wanted you at some point to remind yourself that you could see an architecture question. If you've seen some of my resources online, I think I had given you, site plans and structural plans. Just to make sure you need to remember how to just describe walking through some of these spaces. It's really, really important on this one because every single thing you're seeing here is an architecture part or question, and they're complex, and that the structure, you have to understand the spatial arrangement as well as the decoration. You have to understand in this question a lot about what people believe and what they do in that space. So I thought it was a good question to kind of practice with. But so let's get into this. I've already annotated, I marked my text. So this is all marked up for you, but I want to read through it and block it with you, okay? The work shown is the Temple of Amun-Ra and its hypostyle hall at Karnak from New Kingdom, Egypt. This sacred space was built to accommodate specific religious beliefs and practices. Okay, so I already know this is going to be about what people believe. I guess in this case about the afterlife and their rulers. I don't know. And then what they do in this particular space, which I can only see in the pictures as a ruin, right? I see the big columns and the Karnak hallway up here. And then I can see that linear axis that goes all the way back to the sacred precinct of the gods. We do know this space was added onto and added onto and added onto, and eventually out to the right of the space, there's a huge sacred lake. So it's much bigger than just the central complex of the temple that we're looking at, but I think that's what we need to focus on. Okay, there's the hypostyle hall. Here's a picture of what it's like to be inside that place. So I hope you can see it's proceeding from the Sphinx Avenue out front through a public space and then into a darker and more interior space. Some of you will remember that this is lined up on the Nile, right? And faces the Nile. This is on the right half of the map. What is that? East, west? Oh my gosh, I've been looking at too many prompts. That's the east side, right? And that means that the sun is going to come up from behind this temple, probably right through the uprights of that pylon. Wow, what a dramatic effect, right? Okay, so you kind of have a little context there about the temple, this large, colossal hall, hypostyle hall. Now let's move on. It says, select and identify another sacred space that accommodates a culture-specific religious beliefs and practices. You may select a work from the list below or any other relevant work, which I think is what you're going to see. The one thing that I don't think you're going to see is this even word. I think they just are going to drop it and say, just select. And that way we know we're not getting a point there. That's why I put the brackets there. So guys, just so you know, the brackets tell me that I read this, but I know there's nothing to do there. Okay, so don't just bracket without reading, because you're going to find important information there. We can choose from the Parthenon, Santa Foi, Templo Mayor. This is, of course, a classical temple. This is a Romanesque church. This is the complex you know from the Mexica culture in and around Mexico City. I got to see that. Ha ha. At any rate. Basically now we got to move on. So no point for identification. It says describe the visual characteristics of both the Temple of Amun-Ra and your selected sacred space that accommodates a religious belief. Okay, have to be careful here, guys, because on belief and practices questions, they always want you to really separate these two ideas. What beliefs are pivotal to the visual characteristics that we see? We're going to be talking a lot about Amun-Ra and the sun, and this line up with the Nile that makes this axial kind of approach important. We'll be talking about different things here, but you kind of get the sense it's about what we believe first. Then it goes on, using specific visual evidence from both sacred spaces, explain at least one similarity and one difference. We haven't seen one like this, where you've got at least one of each. That makes that a pretty packed little sucker. And how the spatial arrangement of the Temple of Amun-Ra and your selected sacred space accommodates specific religious practices. All right. So what are the visual characteristics that tell us what they believe? What is the spatial arrangement telling us about what they did there? Is it making more sense to you now? And we have to do that similarity business and difference business about the spatial arrangement. So that's a lot of points there. Then there's this triple threat at the end. Explain at least one difference in how the decoration of these spaces accommodates religious beliefs and or practices. We get to choose. Use specific contextual evidence from both the Temple of Amun-Ra and your selected work in the explanation. You guys can see I did T1, T2, T4. Oops, I see. T3 is over here. T3, similarity. T4, difference. T5, one difference in how the decoration works, right? Okay. And or practices. Okay, so the decoration of these spaces accommodates religious belief and or practices. Use specific evidence from both of the artworks. I should probably box that little and okay, so we see how the points are coming out. I'm gonna annotate right here. Okay, description. Bam, 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 bam. T1, T2. This is visual evidence. And it's all about visual evidence that accommodates a religious belief. Now, we're not comparing and contrasting at this point, okay? You just talk about one, you grab another one, you talk about it, and then we start thinking about how to connect the two creatively, okay? First, we're going to do a similarity, right? Then we're going to do a difference. So put the idea right in the middle there. Then we're going to talk about another difference, right? Around an idea, and then provide or back it up with evidence, okay? So now you can see where the points are: T1, 2, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, and I think that's about all you can do in 25 minutes, okay? So let's look at this. T3, at least one similarity in how the spatial arrangement accommodates a practice. All right, so if this is about belief, yeah, this is about practice, as is this one, but just one similarity and one difference about how the space allows us to do a practice. All right, so what kind of evidence do we need? Visual evidence, visual evidence, visual evidence, visual evidence, right? Okay, so we got something that's the same, something that's different. Now we're ready to move on. Here we're talking about decoration. I'm gonna put deco, right? Decoration of the spaces, and how do they do this differently? And it can either be, it can either be religious belief or practice. So it might not be something that we know from looking at the picture, but we can definitely go to the context for that information. Contextual. I probably should have written that down here either way. Okay. So now you can see where these points are. What can we say? Let's see here. What about religious belief? If you choose something like the Parthenon, the one warning there is that that is both sacred and civic. If you're talking about the Panathenaic frieze, we're talking about Greeks putting themselves on the level of gods. If you talk about that Panathenaic frieze as like a celebration of Athena's birthday, then you've approached like the sacred standpoint, right? But just be wary. We would need to probably talk about the West Pediment or the East Pediment, the birth of Athena, the battle with Poseidon for the naming rights to the city. We would want to maybe even talk about the inner sanctum or sanctuary of the cellar or naos, where only the cult statue is and only priests are allowed. So those are like the functions that go on there. Religious belief, Athena rocks, right? Athena is everything. That's what Athena Parthenos, the Parthenon is the house of Athena Parthenos. And Parthenos means virgin, means pure. So we're talking literally that she basically is the person we turn to. That is our religious belief. But the Temple of Amun-Ra, it's all about connection to the sun, and that the cycle that the sun creates is going to continue forever, and that is going to guide how we set up these spaces and how we proceed in those spaces in a linear approach. We're on the Nile. You have to remember the topography of the land. The sun rises in the east, sets in the west. The east is associated with birth and renewal. The west is associated with death, the end of life. So you can see why the arrangement of the space, basically with the sun coming up here, means that the temple is marking the dawn of a new day, where a tomb probably is marking the end of a pharaoh's life. So you have a lot of information that you could use about what we believe. The Egyptians believe that you will eventually, if you do everything right, be eternal as part of that cycle. The Athenians believe that their go-to goddess is Athena. Sainte Foy, Saint Foy, is in Conques, France, and it's a Romanesque church that shows you a strong representation of Christian beliefs. If you think about the tympanum, or you think about the ambulatory that takes you to one of several chapels at the back, you think about the reliquary of Saint Foy. Basically, you have a lot of imagery about what people believe. Coming to a Romanesque church is something you can do to better your situation in the afterlife, that there is good and evil in the world. If you're thinking about the Last Judgment and that we'll all be held accountable, those are beliefs, right? Templo Mayor. This is a large plaza with a huge pyramid, with two temples on top, one to Huitzilopochtli, the other to the god Tlaloc. One is rain, one is fire or sun. The two of them together, the hummingbird god of war is Huitzilopochtli as well. That's another association. But you have pretty much a representation of the cosmos there. The Mexica did not like tear down a structure and then build a new one. They simply built over the new one, and it becomes a model for how they made the empire what it was. So the Mexica believe that they are the greatest of all the cultures in the region, and therefore they should dominate those styles and take over where they can and put their gods and goddesses on top of the old paradigm. Okay. So there's a lot of beliefs we could talk about there. Spatial arrangement. Okay. This you have to talk about as a linear design, right? And it goes from open public road to inner public courtyard, where we will practice the different kinds of celebrations or observances outside with burnt offering. Then the priests go into the hypostyle hall and maybe even into the inner sanctums, which are marked way back here in the back, with additional structures that house deities of Amun-Ra. Okay, so this is an emanation of the god. We're trying to do things that honor him and bring him present and make him part of the regeneration of life and the cycle to keep it going. There are public observances, there are private observances. You get the sense that this is definitely the engine that keeps the whole eternal cycle going. All right, so Sainte Foy, we talked a little bit more about that. The practice, coming in and venerating the relics. I mean, basically you have to have pathways in order to see all of those in the ambulatory and the apsidal chapels. Bringing jewelry to leave on the reliquary means that you're paying a donation that will make your judgment day go a lot better, right? So people are going to move through that space. You'll have mass practiced still in the nave, but you won't see a lot of interruption as people come and go through the doorway that's specifically set aside for pilgrims. In terms of religious practice, okay, so we've talked about the Parthenon. Templo Mayor, the religious practices that are practiced here. This is the area that's known for sacrifice, right, and bloodletting. Without that bloodletting, you don't go on to the next phase of the cycle. And it's very important that the gods are fed because they gave their blood to us, and we have to return that blood in donations that are pretty regular. The Mexica basically use this also as an opportunity to impress upon the inferior cultures that they are the supreme leaders. So there's any number of things that we could talk about. The large plazas that are there for sacrifices. The victims are led up the pyramid. They're sacrificed in the temple of Huitzilopochtli on the calendar stone. You have Kolyaljalki down at the bottom. I mean, there's all kinds of references to what goes on there. And it's meant to be like in a reenactment of the day that Huitzilopochtli arrives or is born. So you have a lot of practices there that we could talk about. They are similar, they are different. Similarity, Parthenon and Temple of Amun-Ra. Those provide sanctuaries for deities. There are places you go and places you don't as a simple parishioner. Same thing with the Parthenon, okay? Similarity between Sainte Foy. Oh, okay. There are established pathways, right, that lead you to where you're supposed to go. If you happen to be a practicing worshiper of the of Amun-Ra, you walk around the temple and go through Sainte Foy to get to the relic that you've come to see. Similarity between this and Templo Mayor. This is performance space, isn't it? And the top of a pyramid would be performance space. Literally, what I mean by that is that you're supposed to watch something going on there, so we have to have an arena that's large enough to accommodate. The plaza in front of Templo Mayor, as well as the upper platform, that is all about showmanship and state showmanship particularly. So you have a lot that's similar about these things. You can definitely find differences as well. This is like a series of complexes. The Parthenon's one building. Sainte Foy differences. It's a contained structure with stuff inside. This has open air as well as inside. Templo Mayor, it creates like a sacred mountain or a level that you go up. Here, we've got just a subtle increase from the Nile that leads you into the temple, but it's not like a sacred mountain kind of architecture. So there's any number of things that you could use here. I think this is actually a pretty good question. In case you see something, watch out for similarity and difference tucked away in there, because that was challenging. All right, at least one difference in how the decoration of these spaces accommodates religious beliefs and or practices. Okay, a difference. Okay, so I'm looking at the hypostyle hall, and I know that I'm looking at a ruin of it. I know that I have sunken relief and probably would have back in the day had color on the outside of the thing, so that this becomes kind of a narrative of things that were achieved by the different gods, by the different pharaohs. Some of the decoration on the front of the pylons that you see at the front and the additional temples, bear the inscriptions of the pharaohs who put them there and what they did. So I guess we could say the decoration of these spaces is going to be tied to either the worship of the pharaoh or the worship of Amun-Ra directly. Okay, same thing at the Parthenon with the birth of Athena. Sainte Foy, if you look at the tympanum, you're going to see Saint Foy over there. So it's kind of tied to veneration of her. Templo Mayor, we know we're looking at the two temples on top that are most important to the Mexica. So everything seems to be decorated in a way that kind of lends itself to what the practices are. Templo Mayor, you're going to see frogs on the lower levels with a large snake. Frogs are the attributes of the god Tlaloc, god of rain, because they start croaking when it starts about to rain. So they're seen as kind of like accomplices. You remember the DMA, right? The snake is kind of like the cycle of life. If you remember on the calendar stone, the snakes that come around and meet at the bottom of the thing and kind of come face to face, they celebrate the cycle of life and death. So we have lots of similarities there, I think. How's the decoration different? Okay. I'm just trying to see if religious beliefs is better or practices is better. I think you could go either way, really. I mean, if you go beliefs, then you're going to talk about Athena, Saint Foy, or maybe the two gods of the Mexica. Okay, practices. We could even talk about the hypostyle hall, providing air and ventilation, because we're going to be getting into those spaces with torches. We need to let that air out. It also lets us somewhat of an amount of light into that central space, because these are elevated and those are lower. There's any number of ways that you could go with this. And I'm hoping that when I read this, that you weren't struggling to come up with ideas, because we've studied this architecture pretty well. I'm going to leave it there and try to move on to the next video, and hopefully give you a little bit more tips on how to do this if you don't have this, okay? If all you're looking at is a piece of notebook paper because you can't print. All right, so let me get that done for you, and I'll be right back.